Okay, welcome on everyone. It's Thursday, and so we're going to do a Rashi from the fifth aliyah of the Parsha. This was another strange Rashi. If you noticed, I've been using a different platform, not Safaria, but this other website, Al HaTorah, which is, I think, really fascinating. But we've reached another instance where he cuts off the Rashi, and half the Rashi is gone. But actually on Safaria, the Rashi is there. So we're going to do a Rashi in Safaria today, after the story which we've been talking about the last few days, the interactions between Yitzchak and Avimelech, both in Gerar, then in Nachal Gerar, then when Avimelech comes to try to seek him out for a peace treaty once he's already back in Beersheba, and that's how the previous aliyah concludes. And then we begin this new section of the Parsha, which speaks, of course, about the brachos that Yitzchak gives. And the preamble to that whole story is Vayhi ki zaken Yitzchak, Vatichena einav miraos. This famous opening. Yitzchak is old in years, and his eyes become weak. His eyes become dulled, miraos, so that it prevents him from being able to see. Vayikra et Esav b'no agadol, vayomer elav b'ni, vayomer elav hineni. And he calls out to Esav in this famous back and forth that appears in multiple places, usually when God is calling out to somebody, but here in the case of Yitzchak calling out to Esav, he calls out to him and he says, Hineni. Hineni is Lashon Ziruz, as Rashi says in the instance of the many Hinenis in the Akedah. Lashon Ziruz, Lashon Mezuman, it's the language of I'm ready, I'm here, I'm in service to you. It's a language of humility, as Rashi points out. It's a language of saying, whatever I'm doing right now, I'm ready to drop it for the sake of you. Shows great dedication here of Esav to his father Yitzchak. And of course, Yitzchak continues by telling him, Hine nazakanti lo yadati yom mosi. He has a premonition that his death is coming. He's reached a couple of years, as Chazal say on that pasuk, before the age that Abraham died. And so he has a certain premonition that he's going to die as well. And therefore, he tells him to prepare him a meal, and he prepares to give him the brachos. And of course, the rest of the story ensues, which we know about. But the preamble, it's not even a separate pasuk. The same pasuk. The preamble to Vayikras Esav, the preamble to the opening of the brachos section that Yitzchak intended perhaps to give to Esav is Vayiki Zaken Yitzchak Vatichena Einav Meraos. Yitzchak is old and his eyes are dim. His eyes are not able to see as they once were. And so that really shapes the rest of the story. Now the plain meaning of the pasuk is that his eyes are dim because he's old, Ki Zaken Yitzchak, as the pasuk implies. But of course Chazal have different ideas about the source of Yitzchak's blindness in this moment, blindness in the physical sense, and of course blindness here in the metaphysical sense to the larger issues at play between Yaakov and Esav and to who was standing in front of him and who he really wanted to give the brachos to. There's always two levels to this story. There's the physical level and then what we read behind the lines. The question in the back of our mind is always, of course, was Yitzchak cognizant of what he was doing? Was Yitzchak really aware of the behaviors of Esav and Yaakov? Was he really aware of where the brachos were supposed to go in the end of the day? And that's perhaps a shiur for another time. But just focusing on this pasuk, I think it's a fascinating Rashi. Rashi says, Vatichena. What was the source of his blindness? Not according to the pshat of the pasuk, that he was a zaken, that he was old, but there has to be some an additional reason, al pi drush, al pi medrash, about what the source of his blindness was. And the reason I point to this Rashi, and he's going to give three different answers here, each of which I want to throw in a different bucket. But the reason this Rashi is so important is because, of course, as I mentioned, this defines the rest of the story. The way you understand Yitzchak's blindness at the beginning of the story as the preamble is what then allows you to filter the details of the rest of the story and understand what is going on and what Yitzchak's perspective might have been. So Vatichena, the first answer, Rashi says, Ba'ashanan shel elu. In the previous section over here, it says that Yitzchak and Rivka were unhappy with Esav's choice of a wife, and he was perhaps involved in avodah zarah. So perhaps, says Rashi as answer number one, Yitzchak was blinded by the smoke from the korbanos to avodah zarah that were being brought around him. Number one. Number two, davar acher, kshenekar al gabi hamizbeach, v'haya aviv rotze l'shachto, v'osasha niftechu hashamayim, v'rau malachi ashares v'hayu bochim. Next answer, going all the way back to the story of the Akedah, when Yitzchak was on the Mizbeach, the heavens opened up, the Malachim saw their precious Yitzchak being sacrificed on the Mizbeach, the Yardu Dimoseim, they were crying and their tears fell down from the heavens, the Naflu al Einav, and they fell into the eyes of Yitzchak who was lying there on the Mizbeach, Lafikach kahu einav, and therefore his eyes were dimmed, his eyes were blinded. Number 3, davar acher kedei sheyitol Yaakov es habrachos. Maybe this all comes from Hashem, that blinded Yitzchak so that he wouldn't see who was in front of him, that allowed Yaakov to trick him and actually get the brachos that were rightfully his own. 3, as you see, very different answers that really do end up defining the rest of the story. But here's what I want to propose. I think these are not just 3 random answers, but 3 answers that are giving us different perspectives to think about as we read through the story, 3 different versions of the story. You know, you sometimes see these children's books where, you know, on each page, there's a question for the child. Do they want the story to go this way? Or do they want the story to go this way? And then you follow the numbers that go through the rest of the story, and their choice defines the rest of the story. So our choice in reading this pasuk will define A, B, and C, 3 different ways to read the story henceforth. So there's 2 differentiations here in these answers. Number 1, the story of the malachim crying into his eyes and the story of Hashem blinding him in this instance in order for him to give the brachos to Yaakov are both things that come from Hashem. Whereas Ashanan She'elu, the first answer, is something that doesn't come from Hashem, but something that comes from his environment, from the physical world. That's the first differentiation. What I want to propose here is that these are actually the first 2 answers, Ashanan She'elu and Al-Gabi, the tears of the Malachim, Al-Gabi HaMizbeach, are 2 different perspectives. Perhaps Yitzchak's blindness, according to answer number 1, is his blindness to the world around him that impairs him. He didn't see that the Avodah Zarah around him was having a negative effect upon him physically. He got blind. And perhaps, according to Rashi, mentally, spiritually, it was having a detrimental effect upon him. So answer number 1, Tichena enav meraos ma'ashanan shel elu, is a negative answer. It's saying something in his physical environment that was in his control was having a negative influence on him, and that influence was not a good one, and actually impaired his ability to go through this part of the story properly. It impaired his ability to see that Yaakov was the rightful heir to the brachos, which is why Vayikras Esav, the end of the pasuk says, he calls to Esav instead of to Yaakov. That perspective allows us to read this first pasuk and tell us that actually this is what Yitzchak intended. He intended to give the brachos to Esav, but he went totally wrong because he was so blinded by the environment around him, blinded by the negativity around him. The second answer, that the tears of the malachim fell into his eyes, I think is the exact opposite perspective. That's not saying that there's something physical in his environment that's having a detrimental effect upon him that he doesn't see and doesn't want to control, but rather something in the heavens beyond his control happened to him in that moment. And what happened in that moment is not a bad thing, but a good thing. The tears of the malachim, they were crying over the beauty of this scene, over the preciousness of Yitzchak's Mesiras Nefesh, of his dedication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The tears that fell blinded him in the sense that they allowed him to see the world through a different lens. They allowed him to see the world on a higher level. They allowed him to see the world from the perspective of the malachim, of the angels, rather than the human perspective. If that's the case, the blindness here is not a negative thing, but a positive thing. And maybe that shapes the direction of the story in the sense that Yitzchak knew exactly what he was doing, that he purposefully calls Esav. He purposefully then gives the brachos to Yaakov, blinded, which is a positive thing here in the sense that he was able to give the brachos to the rightful heir instead of having to give them, instead of having to discover who was really in front of him. It actually helped him in the context of this story to go about things in the right way. So depending how you understand the blindness, I think it then shapes the rest of the story as to whether the blindness was a negative thing or a positive thing, both when it occurs and then how it transpires into this story over here. Allow you to think about it a little bit more and also think about the beauty of that scene of the malachim crying into his eyes and what the depth of that medrash might mean. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day, everyone.